Dr. Tom Porter, welcome to the podcast. I am thrilled that you agreed to come and have a conversation with me. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Appreciate it. And looking forward to it.
Where are you phoning in from? You look all rugged up.
Phoning in from home, cold Adelaide at the moment. But yeah, work from home some days, which is good. So it's nice to put on a jumper and not have to worry about dressing up for work, which is always good.
Fantastic. And quite possibly the most important question for our conversation. What's your coffee order? Now,
An almond latte would be my coffee order. Yeah.
lovely.
Yes.
Nice one. And is there a book that you've read recently that's caused you to reconsider a few things in your life?
Not so much recently, but a book that probably has would be the classic Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway. I think a book that's about someone's life that, their whole life is experienced in one day, and we see in that one day that person's whole life. And I think that that's just made me think more about appreciating life more and getting out and doing things that I want to do more. Yeah, definitely.
Lovely. And if you could have a dinner party with anybody, obviously your family doesn't include in the head count, who would you love to sit down with and just have a meal with and have a conversation?
Yeah. I think like I love the work of Nicole Kidman, like, just as an actress. Like I'd love to just know more about her and her life. But I'd also really I obviously love differentiation. It's my whole life. So I'd love to sit down with Carol Tomlinson, the sort of godmother of differentiation, and just pick her brain a bit more about the theory of differentiation. And yeah, they're two key people I would probably want to.
Fantastic. That sounds wonderful. Nicole Kidman has not come up before. Out of 170 episodes, you're the first person. I'm surprised. She's a fascinating character. And
Yeah.
Nicole Kidman that you find particularly interesting.
Oh, just the roles that she plays. And maybe it's because I've been watching a whole bunch of shows, and every time I turn on Netflix, there's always some sort of TV series or movie with her. But I think it's just the complexity of characters that she plays that I just love
Yeah.
to like that she just does so naturally. Yeah, that just intrigues me because I often think about, maybe in a past life I should have been an actor, and how and what that would whether I would be as skilled as she is.
That's interesting. Are you a fan? This is a very general question. Are you a fan of the arts? Would you have liked to have kind of pursued that?
A fan, yes. Skilled at arts, probably not. And I think, I did a lot of art when I was in school, and then I remember one of my teachers said to me, "You've either got it or you don't, and you don't have it, Tom." Which kind of stuck. I still remember that back in year 11 art. So I ended up doing a lot more sort of cooking and things like that rather than the arts subjects. I did play piano, but I can't say I was very good at it, I have to say. Yeah.
Lovely. And for those, we'll get into your amazing work around differentiation in a moment, but um, what was your upbringing like, and what are you most grateful for from your family?
I think, I grew up in a small country town. I obviously live in Adelaide now, but I grew up in a small country town about 3 hours away from Adelaide, called Port Pirie. That's where I spent, 18 years of my life. And I think I had a really good upbringing and, really close-knit family. And I think they've given me a lot of opportunity, and they've always said to me that the sky is the limit, and to do what you want. So I think I've had I would say quite a privileged upbringing. I really could do what I wanted to do and pursue the things I wanted to pursue without ever feeling like they would disapprove. So yeah, I think I'm most grateful for their support in my upbringing. Yeah.
Was education something that was valued? Are you from a family of educators or
No,
what?
funnily not actually. Well, like it was valued, but my parents, my dad is an Italian. My grandpa was an Italian immigrant, so my dad comes from an Italian family, and that was very much, you would go and do a trade. So my grandpa was an electrician, my dad's an electrician, my brother's an electrician. So it was quite different that I would be the first to go to university. So I think education was valued, but it wasn't. Even now as a lecturer and a doctor, my parents probably don't quite understand it's not till they kind of went to my graduation that they realized that this was such a big thing to become a doctor of philosophy. So but they definitely value it, but I think trade was very much the route that most of my family has sort of taken. Yeah.
And I think as well that, I mean, that's not necessarily an immigrant thing. That's just, I think just previously, I think that was just an option. I think being an
Yeah, yeah.
was not as acceptable, not as accepted as it is today, or not as prevalent.
Definitely.
That's lovely. I mean, was that difficult being somebody that kind of went outside of the expected trajectory? Because
Yeah, I think I did always feel the pressure to want to be an electrician, you know. I'm not a hands-on handy. I can
that
very
I
much
hear you.
say
Yeah, yeah.
that you know, changing a light bulb is difficult for me. But yeah, the pressure was always there, but then there was also this, you know, you've got to do what what you're going to enjoy in life, you know. And I knew I wanted to be a teacher, but I sort of took a bit of a weird path getting there. Like I was not a sporty kid at all. And then I randomly woke up one day and just sort of was like, I'm going to become a personal trainer. And I did that for 5 years while studying teaching. So they've always supported the direction that I've wanted to go.
And before we start unpacking some of your work and some of your career in education, is there something that you've changed your mind about? It could be personally, it could be professionally. You can approach that however you like.
I think professionally, you know, I have done a lot of work in inclusion and inclusive education, and I still do a lot of work on inclusion, and I value inclusion and inclusive education. But the more that I learn about inclusion, I think about, you know, inclusion is this idea of bringing people into something, you know, to be included into something. And we talk about inclusion in the mainstream schooling. But now I think about, is what we want our students to be included into worth being included into? I think that's something that I haven't quite conceptualized yet, but I think it's changing my thinking about, well, what do we want everyone to be included into? What does that look like, you know, beyond just talking about mainstream schooling? We want everyone to be in mainstream schooling, and we know that that's valued, but what is it that actually looks like? What are we doing to make this thing that we're going to be included into worthwhile? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, and to be honest, mate, it's reassuring to know that someone with your expertise and experience is asking that question as well, because
Mm.
I feel that I don't actually know what we're including kids into. I know
Yes,
it's,
yeah.
but that's kind of all I've wrestled with. So it's good to know that even within your area of expertise, that you're still asking those questions. I think that's,
Yeah, yeah.
and so, Tom, what do you think I mean, what's the role of schooling then? I know it's a huge question, but as I mentioned before, my little one is quote unquote in the system now, and I'm trying to work out like what's the point of school, because I actually don't remember what I learnt. I do remember how my teachers made me feel.
Mm.
That's a very non-question. I haven't really asked you a question.
Yeah, yeah. I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it is a difficult one. And I think, like, you know, I don't try to get into too much ed theory because I know it bores people. But there's you know, the work of a guy called Gert Biester, who talks about these three elements of what is good education, what's it for, you know. And it's not just about passing down of knowledge to, you know, from one person to another person. We also want, you know, I think the purpose is, you know, active citizens that can be part of society, that contribute to society, but also students or people that are independent, that are respectful. So I think you've kind of got these, you know, these three elements of, you know, wanting to instill knowledge in people who are good citizens and active citizens and respectful and independent people. So they're the kind of three things that I think what education should be for. You know, it shouldn't just be about passing down of knowledge. It should really be about being better people, you know.
I think that's incredibly important. And I had the privilege of interviewing that teacher for me that changed
Mm.
a lady called Beth Taylor Jones. I still can't call her Beth to her face. It's just, but I have no idea what this wonderful woman taught me.
Mm.
Currently teach the year that I was when I was in her class, so I know there'd be a bit of fractions in there. There'd be a little bit of three-digit addition and subtraction, but I actually can't remember the lessons. But I remember that when I went into her classroom, I felt valued and I felt seen and I felt heard. And I think the beautiful thing is that there is a whole group of students that have been in a class over the last 35 years who are actually in a Facebook group, and there's hundreds of them, and they all have that same memory of her class, that they felt like the most important person in the class. They felt like she listened to them, and they felt like
Yeah.
they cared. And I just think that there's something there, because I felt like the most important person in that room, but she has done that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. So I think for me, that's a good reminder of what education is about and what's important.
Yeah.
And going back to your point, is I felt so included in what she was doing.
Mm.
I came from a pretty horrible family situation, but I knew that every time I was in her class, I felt part of it. And we had class with a range of abilities, and it was really lovely to see every one of them leaving her at the time with her feeling the same way. And it's a real,
Yeah.
and I'm sure we've all got teachers like that. I'm sure it was the one that made a particular difference in your life. I mean, you told me about your art teacher. That's probably not a positive.
That's probably not positive.
Was there a teacher that you remember going, yeah, yeah, she was or he was that person for me?
Yeah, funnily enough, it was I did everything I could to avoid PE. I hated PE. Yeah, my PE teacher probably had the biggest impact on me because I couldn't get away with anything, like I couldn't pull the wool over her eyes. She did everything she could to make me included, and then she became my food teacher sort of later down when later more towards year 11 and 12, and similar experience, just a decent human being who we respected her because she respected us. We weren't necessarily teacher and student. It was just a good relationship. And so, yeah, I often remember her as someone who I thought, I want to be like you when I become a teacher. I want to have good relationships with my relation.
That's really lovely, and it's amazing. I mean, every single person, whether they pursue a career in education or not, has been to school. And I think part of that is the problem, because everyone thinks they know how schools should work.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
I think what is so fascinating is that we've all got a positive and unfortunately sometimes a negative experience of our time at school. And so I do think it's a good reminder of just the incredible power that teachers hold.
Yeah.
Say something that will, in your case and also in my case, that we will remember for a lifetime. That's really important. Like I said, to remember just the incredible privilege of our profession. But Tom, when someone asks, what do you do? It's a terrible question. Imagine we're sitting around a barbecue on a hot summer's day. How do you respond to that? Do you tell people you're an educator, or do you kind of avoid that?
Yeah, when I was teaching in the schools, I would respond by saying a teacher. But now, being a lecturer, it's hard. It's funny you ask this, because I often feel weird when people sort of say, "What do you do?" And my response now is, I teach future teachers how to be teachers, because people will often say, if I say I'm a lecturer in education, they go, well, what education? They don't think about teaching as a profession. They think, oh, is it health or is it science? And so my default response now is I teach future teachers how to be teachers. Yeah.
Why focus on differentiation? Why is that particularly important to you? Is it an experience at school that you felt like wasn't done well, or was it just something that is particularly interesting?
I think, I grew up with a cousin with a disability, and who went to quite a rough, what we'd call a rough school, She was in a wheelchair, lots of learning needs, and we'd often go to the school as when we were younger. We'd often go and visit her at school and things like that. And I saw how included she was in that schooling system, this rough school that, not many resources, but they included her in everything. And as I started to sort of become a teacher, I started to realize, this idea of inclusive education. And I would think about, well, why are we not why is everyone just not included? Why people have these poor or negative experiences of the classroom, of not feeling valued. And then I came across this philosophy of differentiation, and that, I don't know, I sort of thought I wanted to be that teacher that makes sure everyone in my class just feels included. They are moving from point A to point B in their own way. Yeah, I don't know. I remember learning about it when I was at uni and thinking, this is like, why are we all not doing this as teachers? Like, what's the issue here? And that's kind of what stemmed my whole PhD over the next 10 years, Yeah.
And you don't have to get in details. I don't mean to ask you too much of a personal question, but have you ever sort of felt on the outside? Like, is that an experience that you obviously don't want any other people to feel, but
Yeah.
like you're not sort of, I feel like I'm a little bit left of center, so it's
Yes.
okay. But have you ever, can you relate to that?
Yeah, I think, academically, yes. In the beginning of high school, I would say I was not that kind of, I kind of coasted along, I think. But then, something sort of switched gears in me as I got into my senior years that I really wanted to put in more effort. And I felt the respect and value of my teachers from those positive relationships. So I think, yeah, I think in the beginning, yes, I sort of felt on the outer, but the more that I developed positive relationships with my teachers, that's when I sort of felt that drive to want to improve academically. Yeah.
Yeah, and what I'll do as well, Tom, is I'll put a link to your amazing book so people can access it because it is really a great read. I love when I get a delivery from Amber Press from the wonderful Alicia, and I think
Yes.
yes, it goes another weekend of me avoiding my family, but it's a wonderful read. And why do you refer to differentiation as a dance? That's a really interesting analogy. So why was that inappropriate?
I know it's going to sound funny, but I was watching that TV series, Puberty Blues, and there's sort of like an episode where they start dancing.
Right.
And I don't know why, but something kind of came into my mind where I thought, oh, like teaching is like a dance. And then I sort of thought, well, from my research, I learned a lot about differentiation as being something that we've got to, it doesn't just happen. You've got to be confident, you've got to develop skills in. And I sort of thought about, well, it is like a dance, really. It is this, you've got to be supported by a partner and you've got to practice and practice makes perfect. And yeah, it kind of evolved into this idea of an analogy of a dance. Yeah.
I love it. I mean, it seems like such an obvious description of not only differentiation but also teaching.
Mm.
And I
Yes.
love that there's that sort of dependency on others. There's
Mm.
rhythm. I know some days my days in class definitely run at a different rhythm to previous days.
Mm.
Faster pace. Some days it's a slower pace. But I
Mm.
really loved that analogy. I think it's so important. And Tom, what are some of the misconceptions about differentiation?
Yeah.
You unpack this a lot in your
Yes. Yeah. Look,
actually beautifully written, by the way. It actually feels like a dance when you're reading it. I'm like, anyway, so what are some of the misconceptions?
I think the biggest ones that we know are worldwide is we know that differentiation is really misunderstood. We know in particular it's often associated as something that you do every now and again for a select few students. So often a lot of the literature talks about the fact that most teachers will think they need to differentiate just for their students with disability or just for their students who are gifted. And so that in itself is the biggest misconception about differentiation, that in fact it's actually a whole class, a whole is it achievable? Is it achievable every lesson of every day? But we know that everyone is entitled to a differentiated classroom. It's not something for a select few students. And I think one of the other big misconceptions I didn't write about in the book, but there's a lot of researchers out there at the moment that talk about differentiation means it doesn't align well with whole class teaching. And I think that that's a big misconception, that you can differentiate and still have whole class instruction and whole class teaching throughout your lessons. It's not a one or the other. You don't just differentiate and then move into a whole class. They mesh well with each other. So
I love that. And I have the privilege of working in an incredible school with an amazing team. And for so much of my career, so many years of my career, I kind of assumed differentiation was for the lower kids. And so like I've actually got quite competent, I think, in really supporting those kids that are underachieving. But it wasn't until I moved to this school about 3 or 4 years ago that I realized that every student requires differentiation. And so
yes.
we have an amazing support unit, which is integrated into our school, which is really
Mm.
never seen it done so well before. We have the teachers who are exceptionally experienced with gifted and talented, but there's also a big group of people in the middle that I
Yeah, that's right.
overlooked. And I mean, Tom, how then do we differentiate? Because classrooms are incredibly complicated places, as you'd be aware. How do we begin to find the time to do that? Are we not being efficient? Are there some strategies or some practical approaches that you have of how we can do this better?
I think the first thing that schools need to do is to dispel, and that's what I talk about in the book, is to dispel those misconceptions. You've got to, before, often when I think about professional learning or see professional learning and differentiation, it's that 1 hour, here's a couple of strategies, off you go. And differentiation's not just a set of strategies. It is this idea of good teaching, good proactive and responsive teaching. So I think schools, the first step that they have to take is, get everyone on the same page to understand what differentiation is and isn't. And I think for teachers, the real first step that is so often overlooked is the fact that you've got to start with what the curriculum is telling you to teach. What's the knowledge, what's the skills, what's the understanding that you're asking students, and to work back from there. Whereas what we tend to see with differentiation is, and I know many teachers do this, some teachers will go on to Teachers Pay Teachers or Twinkle and just buy something that says that it's differentiated, and they'll think that they're differentiating. So I think a really important first step is dispelling misconceptions, getting on the same page, and then really getting schools to think about what are the structures we can put into place to teachers to differentiate. How can we have a long-term plan rather than just a short-term, here's a series of strategies, off you go kind of situation.
Yeah, so is that why you talk about assessment kind of being like the opening move, an assessment from the point of view of knowing where your children are at?
Yeah. You've got to know the end point, it's got to be, well, where do I want my students to get to? How can I work backwards from there? What's the knowledge and skills and understanding that I'm going to assess? What are my lessons going to look like to be able to work up to that point, Assessment shouldn't be a surprise to students. It shouldn't be something that tricks them. That's why I talk about the fact that assessment is, as an endpoint, is something that you should really be considering first and drawing from the curriculum.
I mean, that's so important. I mean, one of the conversations that I'm having at the moment with my team is really changing our understanding of assessment, because it's not an end of task or end of term final diagnostic piece.
Yeah.
That does have a place in some cases, but it is also an ongoing sort of formative. Tom, I was just wondering, what's the best lesson you've ever seen in terms of a really well differentiated lesson?
That's a tough one. But I think I was a teacher's aide while I was studying teaching, and I went into a year 8 maths lesson. And I remember this teacher, and I know her quite well still, and an outstanding educator. And she just had, she had whole class, but then she had different groups, and she was really, really thought about who was going into what group. And, her activities for each group were different, but they weren't so far removed from one another that it took her, 6 hours to plan different activities. It was slight little adjustments for groups. And then she really took on this role of facilitator, and she guided me as a teacher's aide to go to different groups and not just spend time with the lower end students. What I loved in particular was that it was a maths lesson, because we know that a lot of maths teachers struggle with differentiation. It's often that textbook approach, and that's kind of what a lot of my research looked at in senior years. But yeah, just this really dynamic lesson that was so proactive and responsive. Yeah.
And that's really, really interesting, Tom. And how did that classroom feel? What was it like being in there?
You could just tell. I remember this class was for lower end learners that were maths strugglers, but putting them all into one class, you've still got a range of, readiness levels to cater for. And I just remember seeing how the students themselves working at these levels where there was challenge there. It was that sort of just right area. It was challenge, but not too difficult. And you could just see that they were enjoying using manipulatives and moving around the room. And yeah, it was a good lesson of everyone being included, no matter where they were at.
It's really magic, isn't it? I love those feelings as a teacher when the bell rings and kids go, I don't want to go to recess. And it's also interesting to realize that if we get engagement right, then we get behavior right.
That's right. Yeah, that connection.
I'm sure you've sat through multiple meetings where you're like, I'm bored and I could be somewhere else. And then you start throwing things or eating chips or I get it. we're just big kids. And I think if
Yeah.
we focus on that engagement and actually create tasks that are meaningful and
Mm.
also structured appropriately for different learnings, I think your job is done. And I had a wonderful supervisor once say to me, you can plan hard and teach easy, plan easy and teach hard. And I know
Mm.
those days that I feel like I've slept in, my kids have been going feral and not feeling,
Yeah.
my class are always off. And I
Mm.
seem to be the common denominator there. So I
Mm.
think taking the time to really focus and really plan and do the hard or do the heavy lifting up front
Yeah.
really does make a difference. And so Tom, you talk about in your book a kind of some of the ways that schools collectively can
Mm.
enhance practices around differentiation. So what would some of those conversations look like at a broader staff point of view? Or
Yeah, I think it's about schools in the first instance making that commitment that yes, we recognize our teachers, some of them are differentiating well, some of them aren't, some of them need support. And making this, it's got to be a commitment. Schools have got to say, right, we are going to work towards improving differentiation for a period of time, and that commitment means a time commitment. It means a monetary commitment because we want to get teachers to observe other teachers who are doing a really good job and to work with one another. So in terms of a commitment, it requires time and money, to be able to replace teachers. But what I always say is we want a narrow and deep focus. We really want to look at where are our teachers struggling? What are the areas that our teachers are doing really well? And setting up some structures that allow teachers to work with one another. So I love the work of Simon Breakspear, who talks about teaching sprints and, getting teachers to buddy up with one another and work with one another, to better in a certain area over a certain period of time, usually sort of 3 to 4 weeks, and having those support structures, because we know a lot of my research sort of talks about the fact that teachers are sort of willing to try things, but if it doesn't go well, then they get really quite negative about it and they go, well, I'm not going to do it again. We want to avoid that. We want to have this approach where if a teacher struggles with something, that they're supported to be able to try again and to do better. And so schools have to have that sort of buddy system in play as well. We also know that teachers learn by doing it. A lot of research again talks about helping teachers to be confident in themselves requires them to do something. So we want to help them do something and do it well,
I love that. And Simon is a huge inspiration, and his work has really been transformative. And I'm very grateful to have had him come on a number of times on the podcast. And he's just so generous. His work is really easy. I don't know about you, but I've
Yeah.
seen so many professional learning things and gone, like, that's great for you, but what does this mean tomorrow when I stand in front of 28 kids because
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out reading groups? And his
Yeah.
work, like, just really applicable and really approachable to teachers. And so,
Yeah.
Simon, if you're listening, thank you. Come on anytime. So, Tom, you talk about sort of the impacts of labeling students. And I just wanted to go back to your conversation, your comment we had earlier about the teacher saying some of us have it and some of us don't. And quite clearly you don't. Did that shape your self-perception when it came to that subject? And was that, do you think you might have gone on to become a
Budding artist, who knows?
budding artist? Because I mean,
Um,
we've all got those. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know, I think I don't think I would have gone on to be an artist, and I still, I'll often, do some creative things. Like I weirdly like to sort of sit and knit and, those kinds of things that just help me to sort of, I don't know, calm a bit from the day, just something that my mind doesn't have to really think about, So I don't know. I don't think I would have gone on, but it's certainly that experience is something that I remember, and while I didn't have, any or don't have any learning difficulties that are diagnosed, there were times where I was a struggling learner, so, but I think in terms of the impacts of labeling, I found with a lot of my sort of research, particularly with my PhD, teachers want students to have that label of a diagnosis. They often seek, let's get this student diagnosed with dyslexia. Let's get this student diagnosed with autism. It's going to help me teach, to know what to put into place to teach those students. And I think in some ways that's really great. And those kind of labels help guide teachers. But in terms of differentiation, it puts students into boxes, it makes teachers think about, I've got 4 students with autism, therefore they all need scaffolding. And so it kind of goes away from the idea of differentiation being about, well, what's your current level of need? You know, where are you at? What are the things that need to be put into place at this point in time? Some students with autism in one lesson might need some scaffolding, some students might not. So labeling is good because it guides teachers on what to do, but the negative of it is that it means that we make assumptions about what students need.
And I think as well, it would be difficult because it would sort of justify poor performance, because I know
Yes.
so many incredibly competent people with a range of learning needs. And I think we don't want to say, well, there's a reason why little Johnny is not performing in writing, and this is
Yeah.
diagnosis he's got, because that's really not the case. And I think it's sort of, for me, it kind of adds a full stop as opposed to a comma to go, well, okay, now what do we do?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I
really,
agree. And
really
I and I think with labels, you know, like while they do guide teachers and we certainly need them to, you know, to understand more about our students and, you know, how to implement things like universal design. You know, there's a reason that the teaching standards is, you know, standard one, know the students and how they learn, you know, and I think it needs to be know the students and how they learn beyond those labels. You know, what are their needs at points in time? And that's why assessment is so important.
it's really important, and one of the many reasons why I started this podcast, as we said before I hit record, is to introduce people to these ideas, like such as yourselves. But it's also a reminder that we are just old kids. Like, we also need that as well. I kind of teach a professional learning approach. It's very standardized, and I think we need to sort of bring back that differentiation even at a professional learning point of view, because we need different things. I know I get bored pretty easily. I'm a bit more of a visual learner, and so I think it's a good reminder that. So if you could wave a magic wand, Tom, what would you like to change in terms of the ways that schools differentiate, and what would a well differentiated curriculum look like?
I think what I want to see from schools, and I talk about this a lot, is the move away from just this one-off professional development. And we see it every term. I've been there every term. We have 3 different sessions on 3 different things. And so I think for me, what I want to see is, I know schools have multiple different commitments. You know, differentiation is one thing. You know, we've got self-regulated learning, you know, well-being, etc., etc., and they all have their place. But I think it's about really thinking about, well, we're going to commit to this idea of differentiation and taking the time to really put in those structures to support teachers. I think that's the biggest thing, and not to jump straight into, well, this is how we differentiate. You know, it is important to know how to differentiate, but we need to kind of know why. You know, we need to know what inclusion is and what inclusion looks like, because again, while differentiation is really quite misunderstood, so is inclusion, you know, and this idea of, a lot of teachers will think that having students with disability or learning needs in their class is just inclusion, you know, and that's not inclusion, and that's not inclusion as well. So I think what I want to see across Australia is a common understanding of what inclusion actually is, a common understanding of what differentiation is in the first instance.
Yeah, and just for my own education, how do you define inclusion?
Yeah, so I guess I quite like Mel Ainscough does a lot of research in inclusion, and there's sort of 4 elements. And I think you know, make that all students have the right to make progress in their learning, no matter where they're at, whether they're working at 6 year levels behind the year level they are, or they're at a higher end, that all students have the right to make progress in their learning. Participation, that they all have the right to participate in the learning goals of the lesson, that no one is exempt from working towards those learning goals. A sense of belonging, you know, so having teachers foster that sense of belonging in the classroom is another one. And I've forgotten the other P. Progress, participation, sense of belonging, and oh my gosh, of course this would happen. There is another P there that will come to me.
That's all right when it does, shout it out. But I think
Yes.
that's really important, because I think to make that distinction between the two, because I feel like inclusion just sort of gets lumped in with everything else.
Yeah.
And it's not just about representation; it's about that access and that equity to be able to engage in a robust curriculum. And I think, thank you so
Yeah.
much clarifying. I think that's really important.
And we don't, it's something that in Australia we're working towards, but we don't do it well yet. Most schools in Australia work in an integration model at the moment. They either remove their students with learning needs or learning disabilities from the classroom to work with teachers' aides, or they get completely different work and are put to the side while teachers teach the rest of their class. And it's not a criticism, but it is in a way that we haven't quite embraced inclusion yet.
And it's not just about sort of giving more explicit instruction to those underperforming students. It
Yes.
obviously has so much to do with the children that are potentially gifted or talented or require support in different areas. And we do tend to remove students as opposed to integrate.
Yeah, definitely.
It's not like that. I
No.
mean, the workplace, you don't take out the people that are not particularly great at public speaking and just remove them from the workplace.
Yeah.
We're all together. We're all lumped in the same building. And so it's a really good, I think, reminder as well that schools are like, and they should be like, little microcosms of society. And I think
Yeah.
to do that better is so important. I mean, I wouldn't want my daughter, who you saw before running in, I wouldn't want her feeling that she's different in any way to anybody
Yeah.
else. And as I said, being a parent for me has kind of made it that little bit more personal. So why
Yeah.
this kid?
And I think, this has kind of always stuck with me, particularly, we often think about inclusion as just students with disability, and it really is about everyone. But if we think about students with disability, if we're removing them from the classroom to work with teachers' aides who, respectfully, are the most underqualified compared to a teacher that's gone through 4 years, we're putting our most highest need students with our most under sort of, I don't want to say under academically, but, underqualified people, and that has always stuck with me, where I think about that's not what our education system should be. Every student has the right to access the teacher. Yeah.
So you have another interesting hobby, not just knitting. I absolutely want to become more proficient at knitting. Maybe we'll have a conversation after this. But you state that exploring curriculum frameworks across Australia, across Australian states is a passion. Firstly, we all have to have something that we're passionate about, so I applaud that. But why is that a particular passion for you?
Because I was a senior secondary teacher for a long time, and I think this also sort of stemmed why I'm passionate about differentiation. I'd go into a lot of year 11 and 12 teachers' classrooms, and they would say, I can't differentiate because I've got that 50% exam at the end of the year that's set by the South Australian's, Certificate of Education Board. And then you hear about teachers in other states, and I can't do this because my exam is 80% and I've just got to get through the content. And that wasn't until my PhD that I started to explore these different curriculum frameworks for senior secondary that I was really quite shocked, because those frameworks would often say, we're really flexible. We want you to differentiate. But then teachers would say, I've got this rule-bound, committee of people above me that are saying I need to do these things, and I've got no flexibility. And so it's been an interest of mine to sort of explore more these senior secondary frameworks across Australia to try to dispel the fact that you can differentiate in year 11 and 12 just as much as you can in year 2 or 3. It looks differently, and the challenges you face in senior secondary are different from the challenges in primary and middle, but it's still possible. You've got to be open to doing that.
Yeah, I love that. And my world is K to 6. So it's really refreshing to hear what happens in high schools, because at some point, I mean, we are obviously all connected. I mean, we're preparing young people for high school who are preparing people to be citizens.
Yeah.
I think it's really important sometimes to step back and see that continuum of learning.
Definitely.
For those teachers that are listening to this that are like, Tom, like, I am just trying to get through the day. I am so stressed. My classroom looks nothing like Pinterest, which is a good thing, I think. I'm so busy just trying to get through the content. How can I do a better job of differentiating each day in my class? What advice would you give to those people?
I really think, the sort of small step is to just really think of, one lesson. What's the goals for that particular lesson? Is it that you want your students to know the difference between a cat and a dog? And then I think it's just about find out before you even get to that lesson, who knows what about that learning goal? Who knows the difference between a cat and a dog? You know, some people will know what a cat and a dog is. Some people won't know them. Some people might know some really explicit details about the different eye colors and hair types, you know? And I think it's then just sitting down and thinking about, well, knowing that I've got all these students at different knowledge of, you know, towards my learning goal, what are some things that I could do to make slight tweaks to my lesson to just cater a little bit more for those students? You know, it's not about, you know, it's a really common misconception, 25 lessons for 20 different students. It's not feasible. We're in a teacher shortage. People are doing reliefs in their planning lessons. But I really think it's just the first step is really thinking about, what do I want my students to achieve? What do they already know about that? And that in itself is a good starting point to get you to think about, well,
Yeah.
what could I do a little bit differently?
And I love that. And do you have any thoughts on sort of extending students and giving students a little bit more autonomy? Because as I said, I know I'm quite good at, I've worked for many years in quite disadvantaged schools. So I'm quite good at that sort of supporting those students that may need a bit of extra help. But
Yeah.
what do we do with those kids that finish the work and are very competent? How do we make sure that they're engaged
Yeah.
in our classrooms?
And again, I think, you know, I come back to the fact that it's, you know, let's look back at our learning goal. You know, let's not abandon that learning goal for the higher end students. You know, again, back to the example of cat and dog. Is it that then we go a little bit deeper? Do we look at some of the biological aspects that are a little bit similar and different between the cat and a dog? So again, still working towards that same learning goal, but we've just gone a little bit deeper into the content. Or it might be that the supports that we're giving to other students, the students who are more highly able, more gifted, higher readiness, maybe they don't get those supports, you know, so or so they've got to go a bit deeper in their thinking. So I think teachers often think that they've got to, you know, give completely different work and they've got to give more challenging learning goals, but you can still have the same learning goals in the classroom, but just going that little bit deeper into content is how I would do it.
Yeah, and I would imagine, I mean, I love your example of cats and dogs because it's just easy to wrap my primary school brain head around.
Yes.
But I mean, the end product would look so different. I mean, you could have some students that are able to say dog, cat, and color it in. That could start to look at the evolution of cats and dogs, or begin to branch out and look at dingoes, or
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right.
I
Yeah.
love that. I love that it's open-ended. And one of the conversations that we're having in school is that the product or the end result can look different. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter how you get there.
Yeah.
We use obviously learning intentions and success criteria quite a lot,
Yes.
but quite often would have additional kind of extension points. So we know, okay, you guys, you're working on these first 3 points. You guys are working on all of the points. And so I think sort of differentiating the expectation, I think, is really.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you have any thoughts on how we use learning intentions and success criteria? What are some of the ways that you've seen they've been successful?
Yeah, I think the key with differentiation is it's about everyone, no one is exempt from that learning goal, you know, which hopefully is being drawn from the curriculum. You know, teachers have determined what the knowledge, the skills, and the understanding are. Differentiation is about going, well, that goal or goals for that lesson is for everyone. And unfortunately, what we do see is the dumbing down of goals for students who are a little bit lower. And that is just not what the premise of differentiation is. So, you know, often we'll see teachers might say, oh, you can just do one question out of the 20, you know, and again, they're doing it with the best of intentions to know that the students might be strugglers, so give them a little bit less work, you know, a bit more time. But then we see the bigger gaps arise as years go on, that students who are perhaps lower readiness, lower ability, whatever we want to call it, you know, they're not being as exposed to the curriculum as everybody else. So then that just makes the gap wider. So I think our learning intentions and success criteria, you know, whatever they are, they've got to be upheld for all students. And that is easier said than done, you know.
Tom, it has been honestly an absolute joy to get to talk to you today. And I'm just so incredibly grateful that you would beam in beautiful Adelaide and have a conversation. And there is no way that we could cover all of your amazing work in our short time together. So my hope is that there'll be people listening to this that may not have heard of your work, but has really sparked something. And I think that's so important. And where can people find more about the work that you're doing and stay in touch?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn, as Dr. Tom Porter is probably quite active on LinkedIn, but and do a lot of sort of posts about differentiation and the things that I'm doing. Another good one is sort of my researcher profile with the University of Adelaide, which just sort of has my articles and my works if people are more wanting to look at the research behind what I do. Yeah.
Well, I'll make sure I put links to that in the show notes. But Dr. Tom Porter, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.